Michael. I am currently the Deputy Principal Editor of the International Journal of Art and Design Education, and I'm a member of staff of Glasgow School of Art. So I thought I'd give a little bit of an introduction to myself, and also obviously the presentation today is going to be giving you a perspective on journal editing from my own involvement in the International Journal of Art and Design Education. So it's very much sort of from my own perspective of having worked in this journal for quite some time. And obviously every journal is going to be different. But some of the things that I'm going to be speaking about are probably quite generic and will be applicable to other areas or other journals that you may be wishing to publish your work in. So first of all, I'd like to just sort of give you a little bit of an overview of my own background. My own background is in educational research within the creative disciplines, specifically focusing on technology enhanced learning in higher education. And I've been publishing my own research for over 20 years. My first article was published directly after my MPhil research, and that encouraged me as a early career researcher, really, and newly qualified at that point to publish work, and I've been publishing steadily ever since then. And I've had a long-standing involvement in IJADE since 2009, so I've got quite a few years of experience of having edited the journal and being involved in journal writing. And I hope I can sort of enlighten you and share with you some of this personal experience over this time. So this is a project I was involved in quite some time ago now, but just to give you a flavor of some of my own research that I've been involved in, this is technology enhanced learning. This was a piece of work, sorry, this was a piece of work I was engaged with previously, and I've had work published in this particular area. This was work to do with engaging young people with Second Life and looking at educational transition in particular. And so quite a lot of my work is focused on technology in this sort of educational context, which is very much interdisciplinary in nature. So if you want to know a little bit about IJADE itself, it was established in 1982, and at that point it was the Journal of Art and Design Education, and it later became the International Journal of Art and Design Education in 2002, and it still obviously holds that title. And it will be 40 years next year, so we're looking forward to being able to celebrate our 40th anniversary very soon. It's associated with the National Society for Education through Art and Design, and this is a society based in the UK, and it promotes the journal. Our editor, our publisher is Wiley, and we have very close connections, obviously working with Wiley over this period. So there's a long-standing relationship with Wiley itself. Essentially, IJADE provides an international forum for research in the field of art and creative education. And you could say it's one of the primary sources of dissemination for independently refereed journals about the visual arts, creativity, design, art history, and all aspects, phases, and types of education and learning situations. And as a journal, we welcome articles really from a wide range of theoretical perspectives and having different methodological approaches to research, and it encourages submission from the broad fields of education and the arts. and particularly obviously concerned with learning through art and creative education. So the current principal editor, who is not able to join us, she works at the University of Chester, and that's Dr. Deborah Riding, and we have a number of other editors who are associated with the journal, and we take principal care of the articles coming into the system, into the IJADE system. So the topics that we tend to focus on, and obviously when you do think about publishing, wanting to publish your work, it's useful to go to the journal itself and check what the scope of the journal is, and the sorts of areas that the journal is interested in receiving research on. In our journal, we're interested in the social and cultural values which inform creative and arts-based education. We're interested in communities of learning, various craft and design practices, international comparisons of art practices. You can see there's a really long list, so it's quite diverse and very wide. And as long as it's focused on education within, either higher education context or a school-based context or community-based context, we're very interested in hearing from our writers. So you might wonder why publishing is something that people do and want to get engaged with. Obviously, sharing something worthwhile is really important, and it will be beneficial to the practice, the education or establishment that you're in, and society and wider society. The advantages of publishing is that it builds knowledge and the sharing of knowledge within and outside your discipline, and it means your work can be cited by other people in the field. It also collectively builds your field and provides reference points, particularly for new areas of research. Someone has to start that area of research. It could be you, and that is a great thing to be able to start doing, and being able to write about that work. The other thing is that a track record of publishing could actually enable you to land a book deal, for example. So it works both ways. You don't necessarily have to have written a lot of articles, for example, before you do that, before you do publish in the form of a book. But it certainly helps once you have established yourself a little bit and you wish to pursue that direction. Obviously, there are disadvantages in publishing, and obviously one of the main ones now, which perhaps is not as sort of critical as it used to be, is the print time for getting an article through the system and into print. And it typically takes up to a year to get an article published, and that's I guess I think a fairly accurate assessment of the length of time things take to be put through the system, to be reviewed, and I'll mention and discuss that in a minute, and for it to be amended and resubmitted, and it has to go through the article setting process and then finally out to print and online as well. The other thing is that when you're in the process of submitting a journal to an article, an article to a journal, it's not advisable to be submitting to another journal the same article. In fact, you usually have to declare whether that article has, is the only article that you've written, and you haven't sent it elsewhere for consideration. So it can be a frustrating process, I guess, in terms of getting your work out there. And there are now more and more online journals, some of them open source, some of them perhaps a little bit more nimble in terms of publishing, but typically that would appear to be the general time frame for getting your work out there. So you're beginning your journey, and hopefully this is a wonderful, exciting journey for you. You've got some research that you would like to share, you'd like to get it out there. Where do you begin? The most important thing is that you've got something and you have the motivation and the desire to do something about it and start disseminating it. And you may have started this process already by, for example, doing a presentation in a workshop, or discussing your work amongst colleagues and getting feedback on it. You may have done a conference presentation somewhere and wishing to then further develop the paper for publication. So you have to start somewhere, and often these small steps help in terms of getting yourself orientated towards the writing process. So you're interested in publishing. How do you begin? So essentially, obviously, finding a topic of research that interests you and in which you have direct involvement is really important. And sometimes, you may be thinking that you need to publish on something, but you don't necessarily have the desire or necessarily the deep interest in the topic. So, if you're going to be developing some article or some kind of publication for the first time, make sure it's your passion. Identify a suitable journal and understand the readership of that journal and the criteria of that journal. And that's really important. Look back at the back issues of that journal. Make careful assessment of consideration of the assessment criteria, and ask yourself, is this the most suitable journal for my work? Because, as I mentioned earlier, once you put your article into a journal submission system, unless you decide to withdraw it, you've got to, sort of sit with the time that it takes to get that paper through the review process. So it's important to make sure that you target the right journal in the first place. Otherwise, you might be wasting quite a lot of time with that. And I think the key thing that I would like to sort of emphasize is seeking support from whoever you can, your colleagues, your mentors. It might be that you can attend a writing retreat or a seminar, anything that gets you into the frame of mind of writing, and being able to get as much support as you can from colleagues and those who have more experience of writing is really important. They can give you a good sound advice and also help your motivation and your confidence and all of that. Also consider co-writing an article with a colleague. You might just start a conversation over a coffee. I remember one of my first articles that I wrote was with a colleague. We just struck up a rapport over a subject that we were both very passionate about. And the process of writing that article together was really quite amazing and very, very enjoyable. And I think our collective motivation and interest in the subject really carried us through the process of writing, drafting, redrafting, and submission. And actually, it wasn't as painful as we thought it was going to be. So sometimes starting off co-writing with someone else is a good idea. So my key message here is start small and work it up. Discuss, write, discuss, work with someone who has written before, It could be someone who perhaps may have been a supervisor or a teacher previously. It could be another colleague, but find whoever you can to help, and don't be afraid to ask for help either. Another thing is seeking a critical friend. So I think for this, you know, it's really important to get somebody who can look at your draft objectively. So there's something about someone saying they would be prepared to look at your draft and offer you comments upon it before it goes into, before you submit it into a journal. And what you really want is honest feedback to enable you to make the kinds of amendments that you might need to do before final submission. As I said earlier, submitting a conference abstract and getting your work presented at a conference is a really good morale boost, and it's good for your confidence, and getting feedback is really valuable. Within the journal that I work for, we do an annual conference, an annual educational research conference, first of which we hosted online this year. And at the end of the conference, we asked our delegates to vote on the papers they would like to see published in the journal. And our emphasis in this particular journal, and I'm not sure what the emphasis is in other journals, but certainly within our journal, is the emphasis on early career researchers, new writers. And so we have one journal special issue dedicated to new writers every year. And for many people, this is a very seminal sort of opportunity to publish work in the journal. And it's a useful sort of jumping off point for writing into the future. So the other thing that you could also do, if you're interested in journal writing, you're interested in just seeing how other people write journals, is to sign up to be a journal reviewer. And many journals are very keen to extend their reviewer network. So for example, our journal, the International Journal of Art and Science Education, really welcomes expressions of interest from people who would like to actually review an article. And we do give advice as to how to review an article. And because obviously so many people are writing across such a broad range of subject areas within the creative disciplines, we're always looking for people who can offer a perspective and can help to shape a paper, or offer comments that would help the writer to make a better contribution. So if you're interested, that's certainly from our perspective a great place to start. And then you also get to see the variety, and it does help a lot. So the other thing that I think is really important here is just make sure that you follow the journal editing guidelines very carefully, because you don't want to create any unnecessary distractions. So that would be my real first I suppose, first point of advice. What we see sometimes is people submitting articles to our journal that just don't follow the guidelines, and the article has to be returned to the writer, unfortunately, until and recommendations made to follow the journal guidelines and then come back. So that could be anything from formatting issues to incorrect referencing or no referencing. Sometimes people forget to do that. They forget to include their reference list. So it's really important to follow the guidelines, including, the inclusion of images and the way those images are included, and how they're named, for example, just things that are just standard considerations that you would need to give when submitting an article to any journal. So when your paper is submitted to a journal, it's usually blind peer reviewed. And I'm sure you probably know what this means, but it means essentially that your name and your affiliation is not made known to your reviewer. And equally, your reviewer's name is not revealed to you as the author. And in our journal, we have 2 blind peer-reviewed people who are involved in that process. So you should get 2 reviews. And then what happens is the editor looks at both of those reviews, reads the paper, and makes a recommendation. It may be that your reviewers have both said there's some amendments and corrections to be made, but essentially your work is publishable, and if you make these amendments, we would consider publishing it. Obviously, ethical considerations when you're writing an article need to give a consideration. So needing to be very explicit about how, for example, ethical consent was obtained, and it needs to be explicitly discussed in relation to any research involving participants, and relevant ethical guidelines referenced. So that's for our journal, that's really important, that the ethics is discussed and is upfront and explicit. What I'd like to say is that, for example, if you're submitting a journal article, you may be asked to submit several iterations of this before it gets accepted. And this is really normal, even for experienced writers. And I know this might sound a bit long-winded in a way, a long-winded process, but this is typically what the process involves. So don't lose heart if you still, if you feel that you've had to, submit it and then it gets reviewed again and more comments come back. That's perfectly normal. And one has to just be patient for that process. But it is worth it in the end. So I'm just going to give you a few things that we look for, and these are the sorts of things that if you were going to be submitting to any other journal would typically be some of the things that others would want to see. So for example, in our journal, the title and the abstract, do the title and the abstract accurately summarize the contents of the article? So important thing here is getting the abstract very clear, and does it relate well to the article? Are they suitable for internet engines to pick up? So for example, is your title and your abstract searchable easily? I think that's really important, because if you choose a really obscure title that may be difficult to pick up, it may be then more difficult to find your work. So think about the title when you're writing an article, in terms of how easily an internet search engine will pick it up. In our particular journal, we're really interested, obviously, in education, but we do get a lot of submissions that don't have education within the discussion or within the article itself. It might be a practice, an art practice, but not necessarily tied into education. So think about the orientation of the journal, what the emphasis is. For example, in our journal, we're interested in creativity, arts and crafts, but within an educational context. Is the article up to date? It goes without saying, obviously, you don't want to be publishing research that is getting out of date. So one would need to try and get that work out there as soon as possible. And is there new knowledge or new contribution to your discipline in that work? That's also something that would need to be given consideration. If you are making any substantive claims, is published research in the field acknowledged? Do you demonstrate familiarity with any similar or relevant research in, for example, a previous issue of this journal, or other journals, in fact, as well? So it's about being very explicit about the pool of resources and other research that you're drawing upon for the claims being made in your own paper. And obviously thinking about the evidence that you're providing to support and substantiate any claims or assertions that you're making. If you're going to be reporting on a piece of work, are the research questions clear? Are the methods appropriate? Do you have credible data? Are the findings clear? Are you able to justify the conclusions and the recommendations? And crucially here as well is, if you've got research participants, are they made suitably anonymous in this? Another thing here, of course, is just general structure of a paper. You could have a really interesting topic, but sometimes what we see is some papers that just don't flow as well as they could. And so think about the flow of the article. Is it easy to read from start to finish? And that's why I think it's important to draw upon anybody else as a critical friend to give you some constructive feedback on how it reads. Does it flow? Is it easy to read? Are you taking the reader with you on a journey? And I think that's a really important point. The other thing that we have is an opportunity for some editing facility through Wiley for English language editing. So because we're an international journal, we obviously receive a lot of papers, all of which are obviously written and submitted in English as being the language of the journal. But quite often, obviously, when you receive such a high number of articles, not all the articles necessarily have had their English proofread. And it's really helpful, I think, to be able to turn to a service if you need to ensure that the English languages has been proofread and recommendations have been made for the way in which some of the language is framed. And the other thing is that, one of the things that we like to sort of emphasize here in our articles is about the word length. And this is where an article could get thrown out because it's exceeded the word count. So really pay some close consideration to the word count when you are submitting a journal article. They really are generally quite strict, and if you go over the word limit, it can get knocked back, which means a further delay. So that's useful to know as well. Check whether the quotes and the references and the bibliographies are included in the 6,000 word limit. So that's our limit for our journal, but other journals have different limits. And are there any images? Are they in the correct format? That kind of thing, really important. I'd like to just say something about open access publishing, because this is maybe a mode that you've heard about. It's something that certainly is coming up more and more. So many journals now are moving to an open access mode. That means that anyone can read the articles without having to pay for the articles. And this is really good news for authors, because it means the research has a wider readership, and the barriers to getting your work noticed, and making a difference, I think is you know, I think it's considerable, particularly you know, for the discipline in terms of, well, in terms of this particular discipline. I think it's for us, I think it's really good news. But what this means for institutions, though, is that authors will need to pay a fee, and so that's the downside of it. So for an article to be published currently within our journal, and we haven't moved to open access, so currently we receive articles and authors don't have to pay, but the model is changing, and I think we're going to be, as a journal, we're going to be moved into an open access format, which means that our submitters, our authors, will have to pay. So usually this would involve the institutions or the organizations paying for the articles to be published in the journal. So you know, there's an upside and a downside to this, and obviously it's not so good for independents who would need to pay for the article themselves. And I'm not sure how you get round that. And there are different models being put out there at the moment. And journals are still largely subscription-based journals, where publishers charge institutions to access their journals, and the author does not pay for the article to be published. But as I said, we're moving towards this open access model now, which more and more journals are adopting. So for example, in the UK, we have the UK Research Councils. They fund research, and as part of the money that researchers receive for their research, money is set aside to actually allow them to publish the work in various journals. And this is usually referred to as gold access, and a small proportion of the funding from the research grant is therefore passed to the publisher. So in some ways, you could say that the publisher scores twice, because you know they are able to receive this money and benefit from it. There are other types of access. We have green access, for example, which is the pre-publication draft, which can be made available as an open access document to the public through repositories and university research repositories. So there are various ways in which our research can be disseminated without it necessarily going through that formal route. I think that's probably it for now, and I'm very happy to take questions, but thank you for listening today. I hope that was helpful, and I'd really be delighted to pick up on any questions that you may have now, or certainly within the mentorship chats that we've got later on today. So thanks very much.